Zeno of Citium, Cynic, founder of the Stoic tradition. A. Long. There are two philosophers named Zeno in Diogenes' collection of lives. The older one, famous for his paradoxes, was a citizen of Elea in southern Italy and lived during the 5th century BC. The younger Zeno, who is the subject of this chapter, hailed from the Cypriot city of Citium, modern Larnaca, immigrated to Athens as a young man, and founded the Stoic school of philosophy there at the end of the 4th century. This Zeno's adherents were originally called Zenonians, following the common practice of naming a school after its founder, but the name did not stick. The younger Zeno, in the words of Diogenes, used to give his lectures while walking up and down in the painted Stoa, hoping to keep the place clear of crowds. It was there that under the 30 tyrants, 1,400 citizens had been put to death. People now went there to hear Zeno, and this is why they were called Stoics. The same name was given to his followers, who had originally been called Zenonians, as Epicurus says in his Letters, Book 7, verse 5. Since Epicurus was a few years older than Zeno, who outlived him, we can probably infer that Zeno's students were already being called Stoics during the latter's lifetime. As presented by Diogenes, Zeno is an intriguingly ambiguous figure. We see it immediately in the story about his collecting followers, while simultaneously discouraging bystanders. Diogenes does not tell us what Zeno lectured on, but the subject matter must have been lively enough to attract a crowd of curious listeners. We can plausibly identify the gist of it from Zeno's first and most famous, or rather infamous, publication, entitled Republic. In this work of utopian political theory, Zeno presented proposals that would, if implemented, completely undermine the foundations of a traditional Greek polis and its cultural norms. Currency, courts of law, temples, gymnasia, and traditional education would be abolished. The nuclear family would be prohibited. Sexual relations would be based simply on mutual consent. Unisex clothing and partial nudity would be required of everyone. Ethical goodness would be the only criterion for citizenship, freedom, and friendship. From elsewhere, we know that Zeno also challenged sexual taboos by permitting incest, recommending virtuous teachers to practice bisexual pedophilia, and elevating Eros to the role of the community's tutelary divinity. Diogenes reports that Zeno wrote the Republic under the influence of his first teacher, the Cynic Crates. Book 7, verse 4. This rings true, for many of Zeno's proposals recall Cynic contempt for conventional values and advocacy of nature as the appropriate standard. If Zeno lectured on these themes, we can understand people's eagerness to hear him. Yet Diogenes tucks his account of Zeno's shocking republic into an appendix after ending the life proper with a typically elaborate account of Zeno's death. In the intervening episodes of the ensuing biography, there is no trace of the social and sexual iconoclasm of the Republic. Zeno comes across as surly, prudish, and caustic, but no radical or intriguing cultural commentator. Notwithstanding this scarcely engaging personality, Diogenes reports at some length on the way Zeno was courted by kings and awarded great honours at Athens in recognition of his sterling character, even though he was an immigrant. What did Zeno actually do to earn such accolades that included celebration in eulogistic verses by famous poets? Are these honours compatible with the subversive author of the Republic? Diogenes tells us nothing of any special acts of courage or kindness or civic benefaction. The most striking features of Zeno's character, as it emerges from these pages, are frugality, contempt for money or fame, a sharp tongue, and physical and mental toughness. All Diogenes' leading figures in the Lives are endowed with characters that fit appropriate generic aspects of their philosophies, making them stoical or skeptical in the modern sense of these epithets, as the case may be. But doubts remain about whether Diogenes' portrayal of Zeno's life is fully coherent, and if not, why it is not. That issue will occupy us in due course, but to begin, a prior question needs to be asked. Why did Diogenes devote more space to the biography and doctrines of the Stoic Zeno than to any other figure in his vast collection of philosophical luminaries? The earlier Zeno of the Paradoxes is probably more familiar as a name to the modern public. That familiarity, however, is an accident of history. Given the prominence of Stoicism in both ancient and early modern philosophy, Zeno of Citium should be as famous a name as Epicurus. Diogenes, writing some 500 years after the origins of Stoicism, registers Zeno's significance by making this life the longest of the collection. Much of it, conforming to Diogenes' practice in dealing with the leading Greek philosophers, covers the doctrines of the founder's movement rather than his actual vita. But we are still left with the fact that the pages under Zeno's name occupy 160 chapters, the numbered subdivisions in this edition, of Diogenes' complete work. Next, in descending order of magnitude, come the Lives of Epicurus at 154 chapters, Plato at 109, Diogenes of Sinope, the Cynic, at 62, Pythagoras at 50, Pyrrho at 48, Aristotle at 35, and Socrates at 30. These lives are the longest in Diogenes Laertius' entire collection, which comprises 82 individuals in all. Zeno of Citium tops the list in sheer volume of space. Statistics of relative length apart, these 8 lives, from Diogenes' historical perspective, completely match the significance and influence of the schools or movements associated with the names. Thus, taking them now in their chronological order, we have Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato, founder of the Academy, Diogenes, reputed founder of Cynicism, Aristotle, founder of the Peripatos, Pyrrho, reputed founder of Skepticism, Epicurus, founder of the Garden, and Zeno, founder of Stoicism. Even from a modern perspective, one would be hard put to discard any member of this octet in favor of substituting some other name. All 8 figures, except Socrates, were founding fathers of distinct philosophies or schools, and Diogenes Laertius, in line with the doxographical tradition that he follows, views Socrates as a de facto founder. He makes Socrates the originator of philosophical ethics, Book 1, verse 14, with a succession of Socratics that includes Plato and subsequent academics, and a further line of succession through the Cynics right down to the Stoic Chrysippus over a time span of 2.5 centuries. Book 1, verse 15. After factoring in the relative lengths of these lives, we may still be surprised by the coverage devoted to the Cynic Diogenes and to post-Aristotelian philosophers, and even more surprised by the brevity accorded to Aristotle himself. Diogenes Laertius' allocations of space to these figures, however, or rather the allocations he found in his sources, reflect philosophical and historical judgments that were being made in the late Hellenistic and early Roman imperial epochs. Epicurus, the only philosopher beside Plato to whom Diogenes assigns an entire book, and Zeno were the founders of this period's most popular and culturally diffused philosophies. Aristotle would have to wait another century for his philosophical greatness to be fully acknowledged. Diogenes' seventh book continues after Zeno with the lives and doctrines of 6 later Stoics, making it the longest book of all and about 1/4 of the whole oeuvre in extent. In this historical context, then, the amplitude of Diogenes' life of Zeno, with its lengthy survey of all 3 parts of Stoic philosophy, logic, physics, and ethics, is quite appropriate. What Diogenes could not have foreseen is the exceptional value the life's doctrinal material would acquire for modern historians of philosophy. That is because the works of the numerous Stoic philosophers he mentions have survived, if at all, only in fragmentary and summary form. Diogenes' life of Zeno is a uniquely important source of information about Stoic philosophy in its formative Hellenistic period. The doctrinal sections are also distinctive in the sheer number of their references to what Zeno or Chrysippus or some other Stoic actually said, often with explicit reference to their specific works. Our other encyclopedic sources for Stoic doctrines generally present the material in the form, as the Stoics say, rather than, as Antipater says in the 7th book of his work on the Cosmos, Book 7, verse 148. While Diogenes purports to be giving a general account of Stoicism from the time of Zeno onward, he also cites individual Stoic philosophers and their works with unusual frequency, making his work in this regard exceptionally valuable. We can be sure that Diogenes' authorial contribution to the doctrinal material he records was editorial and bibliographical, rather than creative in any interesting philosophical way. What is largely beyond recovery, however, is the methodology he employed in excerpting from his sources. When he reports Posidonius' theories about the sun's composition and size, he refers to 2 of that prolific Stoic philosopher's books, Book 7, verse 144. He references his statement about the same figure's opinions on the composition of snow by mentioning the 8th book of Posidonius, Discourse on Nature, Book 7, verse 153. Should we suppose that Diogenes had these and other such works on his desk? That is unlikely. Most probably he found the bibliographical information in the sources he drew upon, but we can still ask why he took the trouble to report it so precisely. I raise this question because Diogenes' life of Zeno is a complex composition, not only in the case that it is a patchwork, but also because it invites many questions about what it seeks to tell us, both about Zeno's biography and about the account of Stoic doctrines as such. Of all the ancient philosophical schools, the Stoa in the Hellenistic era was the largest in the sheer number of attested figures who have left a mark on the historical record by their output of books. It was also one of the most diverse schools in the detailed positions adopted by its leading thinkers, especially during its formative years. As in the schools of Plato, Aristotle, and Epicurus, Zeno was followed by an official line of successive heads. Book 7 of Diogenes includes the lives of the first 2 of these figures in the persons of Cleanthes, who was a student of Zeno's, and Chrysippus, who was probably too young to have actually been taught by the founder. The life of Chrysippus breaks off at the point where Diogenes is in process of recording that philosopher's enormous bibliography. Book 7, verse 202. Between Cleanthes and Chrysippus, Diogenes, Book 7, verse 177, presents the life of Severus. This Stoic, another student of Zeno, became the court philosopher at Alexandria to one of the Ptolemaic kings. Immediately after Diogenes concludes his generic account of Stoic physics, but before commencing the life of Cleanthes, he appends brief lives of 3 dissident Stoics, Book 7, verse 160, Ariston, Herulus, and Dionysius. These three philosophers had all associated with Zeno, but they came to differ from him sufficiently to be ousted from the orthodox Stoic entourage at Athens, at least from the vantage point of the school as it developed after Zeno's death. Zeno had a further student, Perseus, whom we can gauge to have been more compliant, for Zeno sent Perseus, who had lived with him in Athens, and whose father came from Citium, to King Antigonus of Macedonia as a proxy for himself. Book 7, verse 36. Both parts of Diogenes' life of Zeno, the biography section and the much longer doxography, draw on authors who range in date from Zeno's own lifetime down to the middle years of the 1st century BC. Following Chrysippus, the most noteworthy Stoic philosophers, as we know from elsewhere, were another Diogenes of Babylon, Antipater of Tarsus, Panicius of Rhodes, and Posidonius of Apamea, Syria. These and several others are frequently cited in Diogenes Laertius' doctrinal sections, especially Posidonius for his views on physics. Some scholars think Diogenes originally ended his book on the Stoics with the lives of these and other later Stoics, but had he done so, that work would have become unwieldy. We should assume, rather, that these later Stoics are represented in the doxography because Diogenes' sources, or some sources of his sources, made prominent mention of them. Stoic philosophers presented a united front on such basic doctrines as the world's providential governance and the necessity and sufficiency of virtue for happiness. On much else, including the scope of the school's curriculum, there was not only disagreement between individual thinkers, but also considerable development through time. Whereas Epicureans reverenced their founder's words and regularly celebrated his birthday, Stoic philosophers were charged by a Platonizing critic with constant quarrelling among one another for the more than 4 centuries up to his own time. Diogenes Laertius, as we have seen, indicates schisms among the first generation of Zeno's students, but disagreements did not stop there. Chrysippus was challenged on points of moral psychology by Posidonius, and Panicius questioned the doctrine of the world's everlasting recurrence. Zeno seemingly laid down a broad agenda for his followers, especially in the doctrine of the world's providential governance and the ethical need to extirpate irrational emotions, but it was Chrysippus who established the school's intense focus on logic, for which it was famed and also criticized in Roman times. Signs of disagreement and difference of emphasis between individual Stoics are explicit in Diogenes' outline of Stoic doctrines, especially in its introductory pages, Book 7, verses 39 to 42, and they continue to be evident later if we read between the lines. Equally noteworthy, on the other hand, is how often Chrysippus' name and works are cited alongside those of Zeno, indicating their community of viewpoint. Book 7, verses 134, 136, 142 to 143, 148, and 150. I take this solidarity as an indication that Diogenes was working from sources that wanted to emphasize continuity between the founder of the school and Zeno's second and greatest successor. Unlike Epicurus, who was notorious for his large output of books, Zeno was not a voluminous author. Just as we have wondered about what exactly Zeno did to impress the Athenians so strongly during his residence in their city, we may also ask whether Stoicism would have become one of Greece's greatest philosophical schools without the strong input of Chrysippus. To sharpen the relevance of this question, I turn now to take a closer look at the biographical sections of Diogenes' life of Zeno. We may begin with an analytical summary of the contents, to which I attach the paragraph numbers in parentheses. I also note the names of the main sources cited or probably used for these paragraphs by Diogenes or by Diogenes' sources, together with the approximate dates of their flourishing. The names of Stoic philosophers are printed in bold. A. Nationality and Physique, Book 7, verse 1. Timotheus, circa 250 BC. Apollonius, 50 BC. Perseus, bold print, 280 BC, and Chrysippus, bold print, 240 BC. B. Philosophical teachers, Book 7, verse 20. Hecaton, in bold print, 80 BC, and Apollonius. C. Conversion to Philosophy, Book 7, verses 3 to 5. D. List of Zeno's writings, Book 7, verse 4. E. Zeno's lectures in the Athenian Stoa, Book 7, verse 5. F. Zeno's Honours and Decrees at Athens, Book 7, verses 6 to 12. Apollonius. G. Biographical Chit-Chat, Book 7, verses 12 to 16. Antigonus of Caristus, 240 BC. H. Anecdotes and Sayings, Book 7, verses 16 to 24. Apollonius. I. Other philosophical teachers, Philosophical Claims, Book 7, verses 25 to 26. Hippobotus, 200 BC, and Hecaton, bold print. J. Poets' Verses on Zeno, Book 7, verse 27. K. Zeno's Death, Book 7, verse 28. Perseus, bold print, and Apollonius. L. Epigrams by various poets, Book 7, verses 29 to 30. M. Epigram by Diogenes, Book 7, verse 31. N. Conversion to Philosophy again, Book 7, verses 31 to 32. Demetrius of Magnesia, 50 BC. O. Summary, Criticism, and Expurgation of Zeno's Republic, Book 7, verses 32 to 34. What are we to make of this biography? The points of greatest interest and puzzlement are sections B and I on Zeno's philosophical teachers, and sections C and N on Zeno's conversion to philosophy. Why did Diogenes present this material twice, and why did he intersperse these sections with different subject matter? Rather than account for these issues as due simply to Diogenes' random or thoughtless methods of composition, we should take them as evidence drawn from his various sources of disagreements and uncertainties concerning the appropriate way to present the life of the Stoa's founder some 200 years after Zeno's death, at a time when Stoicism, especially at Rome, had become the most illustrious and influential school of philosophy. In approaching the accounts of Zeno's teachers and conversion, we know that an important source of some of his material and its organization was Apollonius of Tyre, who wrote a work in more than one book on Zeno's life during the 1st century BC. Apollonius is named 5 times in Diogenes' Life of Zeno, more often than any other authority. What chiefly indicates Apollonius' significance, however, is not statistical, but the strong probability that his Life of Zeno, just like the sources of Philodemus' contemporaneous History of Stoics, sought to minimize the influence of cynicism on Zeno's philosophical formation and lifestyle. Evidence for this claim is indirect, but more than mere conjecture. Before turning to it, we need first to see that a minimally cynic Zeno is in stark tension to the general structure of Diogenes' composition. The main determining principle of Diogenes' lives is succession, meaning a line of development that supposedly runs from the founder of a school onward. Book 1, verses 14 to 16. This hoary compositional device could be authentic, in the sense that the line from Plato to Clitomachus, Diogenes books 3 and 4, genuinely represents successive heads of the academy, but the successions could also be quite artificial, as they are in the case of Diogenes' first book, which runs from Thales to Pherecydes, in a line of figures who long preceded the origin of philosophical schools, either in the institutional sense or in a looser sense of master and pupil. According to Diogenes' introduction of the succession scheme, as we have seen, there was a line from Socrates via Cynics down to the Stoic Chrysippus. In full, this line went from Socrates to Antisthenes to Diogenes of Sinope to Crates to Zeno to Cleanthes to Chrysippus. The second half of the line is a genuine succession, but not the first half. Antisthenes was a leading associate of Socrates, but he did not found a Cynic school in the sense of a formal institution. It is uncertain whether Diogenes studied under him or even met him. Crates did associate with Diogenes, but their association too was informal rather than institutional. That brings us to Crates and Zeno. Diogenes Laertius devotes Book 6 of his Lives to a succession of cynics, starting with Antisthenes and concluding with Menedemus. He ends this life by giving a summary of the doctrines they, cynics, held in common, Book 6, verses 103 to 105. By way of preface to this account, he alludes to Ariston, Zeno's dissident pupil, who, he says, agreed with the Cynics in restricting philosophy to ethics. Diogenes' summary of generic Cynic doctrine includes the following passage, which I quote in full. They also hold that the goal is to live in accordance with virtue, as Antisthenes says in his Heracles, exactly like the Stoics. For these two schools have much in common. Hence it has been said that cynicism is a shortcut to virtue, and it was in the manner of the Cynics that Zeno of Citium lived his life. Verse 105. They also think that one should live frugally, eating only for nourishment and wearing only the cloak, and they despise wealth, fame, and noble birth. Some, at any rate, eat nothing but vegetables, drink nothing but cold water, and use whatever shelters or tubs they find, like Diogenes, who used to say that it was characteristic of the gods to need nothing, and of godlike men to need very little. They hold that virtue can be taught, as Antisthenes says in his Heracles, and once acquired cannot be lost. That the wise man is worthy of love, has no flaw, and is a friend to his like, and that nothing should be entrusted to fortune. They maintain, like Ariston of Chios, that what is intermediate between virtue and evil is indifferent. These, then, are the Cynics. We must turn to the Stoics, whose founder was Zeno, a student of Crates. What immediately follows this passage is the first line of Diogenes Laertius' Life of Zeno. Diogenes' readers then, if they read his work in its book sequence, will not only come to Zeno with the information that he was a student of Crates, they will have also learned that Zeno actually lived the Cynic way of life, consisting of frugality and contempt for wealth, fame, and noble birth. Diogenes' anecdotal material concerning Zeno illustrates his adoption of these principles. See, for instance, Book 7, verses 16 and 26. The doctrine that virtue is the goal of life also comes up repeatedly. Book 7, verses 7, 8, and 10, and 30. Diogenes leaves no doubt, therefore, that Zeno was strongly influenced by cynicism, and cynicism as taught by Crates. Yet he doesn't quite say that Zeno exemplified every cynic trait mentioned here. Only some cynics are vegetarian, abstainers from wine, and willing to live in tubs rather than houses, and it is Ariston, Zeno's dissident pupil, to whom the indifference doctrine is attributed. As we are told in Diogenes' Life of Ariston, Book 7, verse 160, he, rather than Zeno, went the whole way with the cynics. That difference, however, as one starts to read the life of Zeno in its cynic context, is not a matter of any great emphasis. We can expect to hear about Zeno's tutelage under Crates, as indeed we will hear of it, in some detail. Let us now ask how, if we were conservative Romans of elite status like Cicero, we would respond to a Stoic philosophy that not only advocated contempt for wealth, fame, and noble birth, but also espoused the scandalous doctrines that Zeno had put forth in his Republic, the impetus to which had reached him from Crates, and more remotely from the cynic Diogenes. Cicero dismisses the cynics, or some Stoics who are virtually cynics, with scorn and unmistakable disgust. De Officiis, Book 1, verse 128. He was not alone in his patrician responses. Some Stoics had already become so embarrassed by Zeno's Republic that one of them, as Diogenes Laertius tells us in his appendix, Book 7, verse 34, a librarian at Pergamon actually deleted the offending passages from Zeno's works. We are now in a position to return to Apollonius' Life of Zeno. Diogenes, on the authority of Apollonius, records an exchange of letters between Zeno and King Antigonus of Macedonia, Book 7, verses 7 to 9. There is no good reason to reject out of hand the king's interest in Zeno, though it does recall, a bit too neatly, Alexander the Great's interest in the cynic Diogenes. What provokes more suspicion is the unctuous tone of the king's letter inviting Zeno to visit him, and the bland and condescending tone of Zeno's response, wherein he declines the invitation on grounds of age. Nothing could be further from cynic asperity and frankness. We can be virtually certain that the correspondence is a fabricated and rather unconvincing attempt to give Zeno a polish and social standing that were quite at odds with a cynic demeanour. As to Zeno's Athenian honours, while they were presumably genuine, the eulogistic decree proposing them was not prompted by an outpouring of democratic love of Zeno. It was moved by the Macedonian king's agent at Athens, Book 7, verses 12 and 15. It would be naive to think that philosophy at Athens was immune to influence from political power brokers. Evidence both to acknowledge and to play down the influence of Crates comes from the sections I have marked B and I and C and L in my analytical summary. This material, as I mentioned, raises two large and overlapping questions. Who were Zeno's philosophical teachers, and how did Zeno come to be interested in philosophy? Diogenes starts the Life, Book 7, verse 2, by reminding his readers that he has already told them Zeno was a student of Crates. He continues with an evasive "they say" to report that Zeno attended the lectures of Stilpo and Xenocrates for 10 years, according to Timotheus in his Dion, and those of Polemon as well. After describing how Zeno first encountered Crates, composed his Republic under Crates' influence, and experienced other teachers, Diogenes writes, he finally left Crates and studied with the above-mentioned men for 20 years, Book 7, verse 5. The 10-year or 20-year inconsistency does not inspire confidence in Diogenes' authorial control. Moreover, chronology excludes the possibility that Zeno had actual contact with the Platonist Xenocrates as well as his successor, Polemon. Crates, Stilpo, and Polemon might seem a sufficiently varied bunch to give Zeno as broad an education as any budding ancient philosopher could want, but near the end of the life Diogenes reports, on the authority of Hippobotus, one of the earliest sources, that Zeno studied dialectic with Diodorus Chronos, Book 7, verse 25, and only after that training, as if it were a necessary qualification, proceeded to Polemon. All of this, apart from the misinformation about Xenocrates, could be true. What we know, or think we know, of Zeno's philosophy from elsewhere could seem to authenticate it. Unfortunately, Diogenes himself says little to corroborate the details beyond the close and initial association with Crates, supplemented by Zeno's interest in dialectical disputes and sophisms, Book 7, verses 16 and 25. Apart from his detailed excursus on Zeno's Republic, which confirms the Cynic connection so pointedly, Diogenes is largely reticent in the biographical part of the life about Zeno's specific contributions to Stoic doctrine. How did Zeno come to be interested in philosophy in the first place? On this theme, the life is even more uncertain. Sections B, C, and N yield 3 accounts. The first account is this. On the authority of the coeval Hecaton and Apollonius, roughly of Cicero's age, we are told, Book 7, verse 2, when he, Zeno, consulted an oracle about what he should do to live the best life, the god replied that he should have intercourse with the dead. Grasping the oracle's meaning, he read the works of the ancients. Diogenes tells nothing about the chronology and location of Zeno's oracular consultation. We are left to guess whether it occurred when Zeno was a youth in Cyprus or after he reached mainland Greece. Mysterious though the passage is, there can be little doubt about its implicit meaning. Zeno is represented, just like Socrates in Plato's Apology, as someone whose life-changing moment was an oracular response. In addition, Zeno interpreted the oracle, we are to understand, as an injunction to study works that could tell him about Socrates. The Socratic connection, though only implicit in this first account, is made definite in Diogenes' next paragraph. There, however, instead of giving an elucidation of the oracle, Diogenes writes, he, Zeno, became a student of Crates under the following circumstances. Transporting a cargo of purple dye from Phoenicia to the Piraeus, he was shipwrecked. On reaching Athens, he was then a man of 30, he sat down in a bookseller's shop. Verse 3. The bookseller was reading aloud the second book of Xenophon's Memorabilia, and Zeno was so pleased that he asked where such men could be found. At that very moment, fortunately, Crates happened to be walking past. Pointing him out, the bookseller said, "Follow him." From then on he studied with Crates, proving in other respects well suited for philosophy, though he was bashful about adopting Cynic shamelessness. Hence Crates, who wanted to cure him of this, gave him a pot of lentil soup to carry through the Ceramicus. And when he saw that Zeno was ashamed and tried to keep it hidden, he struck the pot with his cane and broke it. As Zeno was running away, the soup streaming down his legs, Crates said, "Why run away, my little Phoenician? Nothing terrible has happened to you." Xenophon's Memorabilia, on this second account, gave Zeno a fortuitous literary introduction to Socrates at a time when he was already a travelling salesman. The main point of this nicely embellished story is not to connect Zeno with Socrates, but to explain how he became Crates' student. We should notice, though, that while the account is generally positive about Zeno's association with Crates, it is careful to exempt Zeno from Cynic shamelessness. We should now jump ahead to section N, noting its curious position after the epigrams on Zeno's death. Demetrius of Magnesia, in Men of the Same Name, says that Zeno's father, Nicaeus, being a trader, came often to Athens and brought home many books about Socrates for Zeno, who was still a boy. Verse 32. Thus, even in his native place, he got good training, and then, on reaching Athens, he attached himself to Crates. And it seems he adds that when the earlier philosophers were unsettled in their views, Zeno defined the goal of human life. They say he used to swear by the caper, just as Socrates swore by the dog. This third story of Zeno's conversion to philosophy neatly reconciles the two earlier accounts. We now learn that Zeno was in fact devoted to Socrates long before he reached Athens. Hence his encounter with Crates was not fortuitous but deliberate. But as the second account also proposes, Zeno attached himself to Crates as a means to gain access to Socrates. To emphasize the hallowed Socrates as Zeno's primary allegiance, this third account tells us that Zeno aped Socrates, who used to swear by the dog, in adopting a special oath as his trademark. These three accounts are mutually consistent, more or less, but their emphases differ strikingly. The first account, the oracular story, hints strongly at Socrates and omits Crates. The second and third accounts connect Zeno with both Crates and with Socrates, but with differences of emphasis. The second account gives us a lively and largely positive portrait of Zeno's encounters with Crates. The third account, focusing more strongly on Zeno's Socratic connections, is entirely factual and dispassionate. No source for the second account is mentioned, but I think we can be fairly sure that Diogenes did not get it from Hecaton and Apollonius, who were his sources for the oracular account. I take it that both these authors, writing at around the time of Cicero, were eager to play up Zeno's Socratic connections and to play down his early Cynic phase. Cynicism, of course, was a Socratic movement in many of its ideas and prescriptions. In the Roman Empire, as we know from the works of Seneca and Epictetus, Stoic philosophers were happy to acknowledge Cynic aspects of Stoicism. That phase of philosophical history, however, long postdates Diogenes' sources. The second account is not only the fullest, but is also, in light of its circumstantial detail, probably the earliest, which is not to say that it is historically exact. Was Zeno really, as this account claims, a Cypriot dye merchant who suffered shipwreck? We are left guessing about the exact sequence of events, for after digressing to Zeno's publications, Diogenes returns to the shipwreck. He, Zeno, finally left Crates and studied with the above-mentioned men, that is, Stilpo, Xenocrates, and Polemon, for 20 years. Hence he is reported to have said, "I had a good voyage when I was shipwrecked." Others, however, claim that Zeno said this in reference to his time with Crates. Verse 5. Some say he was spending time in Athens when he heard that his ship was wrecked, and he said, "Fortune does well to drive me to philosophy." But others say that it was after he had disposed of his wares in Athens that he turned his attention to philosophy. The chronology is again wildly inaccurate, making Zeno more than 50 years old when he finished studying with other philosophers. As to the discrepant accounts of Zeno's turn to philosophy after shipwreck, what lies behind them is probably a Hellenistic liking for romantic stories about the conversion of a worldly figure to an ascetic lifestyle rather than anything genuinely historical. The mercantile and shipwreck stories are completely absent from section N, the third account. Now it is not Zeno, but his father who is the merchant. This account, the authority for which is the 1st century BC source, Demetrius of Magnesia, reads like a further attempt to play down both the cynic and the salesman connections in favour of Zeno as earnest schoolboy, dedicated to Socrates from his early days. This emollient account, like the first one, was probably current some 200 years after Zeno's death. Attempts to detach the mature Zeno from his cynic origins mark Diogenes' life intermittently throughout, but in the end they failed to dislodge the impression that Zeno's encounter with Crates was the most decisive moment in his life. Much of the anecdotal material and many of Zeno's apothegms would be completely at home in Diogenes' biographies of the Cynics. Zeno has the cynic Diogenes' gift for repartee, the cutting rejoinder, and the mockery of pomp and circumstance, and he too, though less drastically, practised poverty. The chief difference between Diogenes and Zeno, in Diogenes Laertius' two lives, is stylistic and professional. Diogenes was a showman, using shock tactics as his teaching method and flourishing in the limelight. Zeno, temperamentally scholastic and unsociable, became the professor who grafted cynic challenges to conventional values onto a comprehensive philosophy of universal and human nature. Diogenes' biography of Zeno is an amalgam of fact, hearsay, and fantasy. Which predominates? Fact, in my opinion, is to the fore in the historicity of Zeno's formative encounter with Crates, however it came about, in the influence of Socrates and the Megarians, Stilpo and Diodorus, and in the final testimony concerning Zeno's Republic. Fantasy emerges in the sanitized passages derived from Apollonius, where Zeno loses his cynic pedigree and becomes rather pompous and boring. As for the anecdotes and apothegms, so typical of Diogenes' predilections, while some derive from reminiscences of Zeno recorded by his contemporary followers, many of them are interchangeable with other figures from other lives. The latter are only the stuff of a Reader's Digest Zeno, a Stoic without the qualities to inspire the real Stoa. Zeno must have been a lot more interesting and brilliant than Diogenes Laertius makes him out to be. He was not charismatic, perhaps, like Epicurus, but challenging, witty, and sufficiently Socratic to stamp that exemplary name on the Stoic tradition ever after. Unlike Socrates, Zeno did write books, but they were probably short and pithy. Much of his contemporary impact was oral, while Zeno's writings have left only scanty marks on Diogenes' treatment of his life. Diogenes has left us our fullest record of Zeno's Cynic Republic. In relegating it to an excursus, Diogenes reflects the worries of later Stoics about their founder's respectability, but he did not suppress mention of it, and for that we should be especially grateful. Skeptics in Diogenes Laertius, James Allen. Modern historians of philosophy recognize two forms of ancient skepticism, academic and Pyrrhonian. The former took root in the Academy, Plato's school, under the leadership of Arcesilaus, the fifth philosopher to succeed the founder as its leader, or scholarch, and was the dominant tendency in the school until its dissolution in the 1st century BC. Pyrrhonism took its name from Pyrrho of Elis, an older contemporary of Arcesilaus, but there is good reason to suspect that the school came into existence or was revived by Anaxidimus of Cnossus, a one-time member of the Academy who was active in the 1st century BC, a good 2 centuries after Pyrrho's death, though one would never guess this from Diogenes' few mentions of Anaxidimus in his account of Pyrrho and Pyrrhonism. If this is right, the members of the later Pyrrhonist movement looked to Pyrrho for inspiration rather than being able to trace a line of succession back to him. It flourished well into the Christian era and is known to us principally through Sextus Empiricus, likely activity in the late 2nd century AD, much of whose substantial philosophical oeuvre has survived. Arcesilaus' contemporaries saw a resemblance between him and Pyrrho, as witness Ariston of Chios, a Stoic who quipped that Arcesilaus was a hybrid, with Plato in front, Pyrrho behind, Diodorus in the middle. Book 4, verse 33. Diogenes Laertius, however, treats the two forms separately. In his fanciful scheme dividing philosophers into two successions, the Ionian begins with Anaximander, the pupil of Thales, and the Italian begins with Pythagoras. He places Socrates in the Ionic tradition, Book 1, verses 13 to 15, and discusses Arcesilaus and succeeding academics who are likewise viewed as part of this tradition in Book 4, which takes up the story, begun in Book 2, of Socrates and his successors. The whole of Book 3 is devoted to Plato, the most eminent of all Socrates' pupils. Book 9, where Diogenes discusses Pyrrho and Timon, is more of a mixed bag. He begins with lives of the pre-Socratics Heraclitus and Xenophanes, whom he presents as sporadic, scattered philosophers. Book 9, verses 1 to 20. Before returning to the Italian tradition, the subject of Book 8, with a life of Parmenides, Book 9, verses 21 to 23. There follow lives of Melissus, Zeno of Elea, Leucippus, Democritus, Protagoras, Diogenes of Apollonia, Anaxarchus, and then Pyrrho and Timon. Apart from Diogenes of Apollonia, all of these figures are connected by a master-pupil relationship, real or imagined. In any case, the lineage that links Pyrrho to the atomist Democritus is likely both real and important. The Greek adjective skeptikos derives from skeptesthai, to look into or inquire. The Pyrrhonists applied it to themselves in order to emphasize commitment to open-minded inquiry that, in their view, set them apart from those whom they labeled dogmatists, so called because they took themselves to be in firm possession of the essential truths of philosophy, their dogmas, obviating the need for further inquiry. Though the academics did not call themselves skeptics and were not referred to as such by others until much later, the description, open-minded inquirer, applied at least as well to them as to the Pyrrhonists, and the affinity between the two schools was widely recognized and much discussed in antiquity. Even Sextus Empiricus, who reserved the title skeptics for his fellow Pyrrhonians and dismissed the academics as negative dogmatists who were convinced that knowledge is impossible, had to concede that Arcesilaus came close to being a skeptic in the Pyrrhonian sense. Outlines of Pyrrhonism, Book 1, verses 220 to 235. Ancient skepticism was characterized by two teachings. The first was akatalepsia, the thesis that nothing is or can be apprehended, which often amounts to and is translated as the denial that knowledge exists or is possible. The second teaching was epoche, suspension, the recommendation that one suspend judgment or withhold assent on all questions as a result of akatalepsia. These were often couched in terms of the ancient philosophical ideal of the wise person. Even the wise person is not capable of secure apprehension and will therefore suspend judgment. Diogenes Laertius presents both Arcesilaus and Pyrrho as pioneers of skepticism. The former, he says, was the first to suspend judgment, though he may have meant that he was the first philosopher to do so in the Academy. Book 4, verse 28. The latter, he says, introduced the practice of akatalepsia and epoche, though both terms were likely first used in the Academy, Book 9, verse 61. As a philosophy that challenges the very possibility of knowledge, skepticism inevitably invites questions about its relation to its own teachings. Do the skeptics judge them to be true and represent themselves as knowing this? How can they do either consistently with their own skeptical teachings? It comes as no surprise, then, that critics in antiquity argued that skepticism was self-refuting. Its teachings could not be asserted without making implicit claims to knowledge. Critics also charged that skepticism, in practice, produced paralysis, apraxia. By prohibiting the exercise of judgment, the skeptic sabotaged our ability to act. These charges, and the responses they elicited from both academic and Pyrrhonian skeptics, did much to shape the development of both varieties of ancient skepticism. See Book 9, verses 102 to 105. Arcesilaus and Pyrrho both belong to the category of non-writing philosophers, Book 1, verse 16, Book 4, verse 32. Their choice not to write may have been related to the non-dogmatic character of their philosophies, Book 4, verse 32. In any case, as a result, the biographical law that is such an important part of Diogenes' book assumes an even greater significance in his treatment of these two major skeptics, especially Pyrrho. The story of Arcesilaus, according to Diogenes, is exceedingly simple in outline. Against a backdrop of undoubted institutional continuity, the skeptical turn initiated by Arcesilaus is presented as a radical rupture in the history of Platonism and of Plato's Academy. Diogenes credits Arcesilaus with 3 innovations, Book 4, verse 38. He was the first to argue for suspension of judgment, epoche, in response to the opposition between competing arguments, the first to argue on each side of the question, and the first to alter the teaching handed down from Plato by making it more contentious or eristic, through the practice of argument by question and answer. As a result, Arcesilaus came to be viewed as the founder of the so-called Middle Academy. Compare Book 1, verse 19. Arcesilaus was unquestionably a major innovator, but this account should give us pause. We may well wonder whether the Academy, before Arcesilaus became scholarch, was really as dogmatic as Diogenes maintains. Plato laid down a fixed set of doctrines, he says, to which his immediate successor, Speusippus, and by implication all academics before Arcesilaus, adhered. A selection is included, Book 3, verses 67 to 80. Other classical sources suggest that the Academy from its inception welcomed a variety of research programs and fostered a philosophical culture of dialogue and debate. There is also an ancient tradition of interpreting Plato as a kind of skeptic. Diogenes himself acknowledges a debate over whether or not Plato was dogmatic in his philosophizing, concluding that he was, Book 3, verses 51 to 52. The idea that Plato was a skeptic may well have been the work of skeptics within the Academy, who wanted to present themselves as the founder's legitimate heirs. In his Life of Pyrrho, Diogenes suggests that some Pyrrhonians held a similar view, Book 9, verse 72. We do not have to endorse the view that Plato was a skeptic, however, to see how effectively the considerations assembled in support of it undermine the opposite view, that he was a dogmatic philosopher. Plato's dialogues abound in expressions of doubt and hesitation. Views are advanced tentatively. The unresolved problems they face and the need for further investigation are constantly emphasized. The Socrates depicted in a number of the dialogues practices a dialectical method of inquiry that permits him, despite his professed ignorance, to subject positions and the claims to knowledge of those who hold them to skeptical examination. Against this background, the third innovation with which Arcesilaus is credited by Diogenes, that he altered the teaching transmitted from Plato through arguing by question and answer, looks more like a revival of the Socratic method so vividly illustrated in several of Plato's best-known dialogues. In this regard, one biographical nugget preserved by Diogenes is especially illuminating. Arcesilaus was such an enthusiastic admirer of Plato that he possessed a copy of his complete works, a fact that, if true, set him apart from his academic contemporaries. Book 4, verse 32. One could conclude from it that Arcesilaus was, and saw himself as, a philosophical practitioner of dialectic in the mould of Socrates. The second innovation should be understood in this light. Mastery of dialectic permits a philosopher like Arcesilaus to argue on either side of a question with a real or imagined interlocutor. The premises that, as questioner, he offers to his opponent are ones to which the latter, the answerer, is committed or which he will find it difficult to reject. They need not represent Arcesilaus' own views, if any, and the conclusions drawn from them will be consequences to which the opponent, and not Arcesilaus, is committed. Arcesilaus' preference seems to have been to have his partners in discussion take a position against which he would then argue dialectically, rather than taking both sides of the argument himself, as the most eminent of his successors, Carneades, would sometimes do. Suspension of judgment, epoche, the first innovation, is the basis for regarding Arcesilaus as a pioneer of a new form of skepticism and as the founder of the Middle Academy. To see how his practice of Socratic dialectic prepared the way for this development, it is essential to take into account the philosophers whom he chose as his principal opponents and partners in debate, the Stoics. One piece of lore transmitted by Diogenes is suggestive. Like Arcesilaus, Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, studied in the Academy. Other formative influences on Zeno, like Crates, the Cynic, also belong to the Socratic tradition, albeit other branches of it, and Zeno, like Arcesilaus, should be viewed as a philosopher inspired by Socrates. From Socrates, Zeno and the Stoics took an ideal of virtue as wisdom, which in their view was the sole necessary and sufficient condition for a life of perfect happiness, eudaimonia. They also took the radical view that wisdom was completely immune to error, a claim based on their school's distinctive understanding of knowledge. They identified apprehensive impressions, katalpetikai phantasiae, as the criterion of truth, the ultimate basis for our grasp of the truth. Compare Book 7, verse 54. These are self-evidently true impressions, usually sensory, that arise in ideal, though not uncommon, conditions. Apprehension, catalepsis, the assent to an apprehensive impression, is a necessary condition for knowledge, but is not knowledge itself, which the Stoics define as firm apprehension, which is unshakable by argument. This requires that the truths apprehended also be understood in their systematic relations to one another. By avoiding assent to non-apprehensive impressions, someone who realizes the Stoic ideal of wisdom eliminates one source of error. He protects himself against the other source, faulty reasoning, by a mastery of dialectic, a discipline the Stoic version of which corresponds to modern logic. Assent to impressions that fail to meet all these conditions the Stoics define as mere opinion, and the wise person will, they hold, suspend judgment rather than harbour opinions. Some of the terminology the academics used, suspension of judgment, apprehension, etc., was of Stoic origin, and the stringent prohibition of opinion, which would require total suspension of judgment in the absence of apprehensive impressions, was also Stoic in origin. Sextus Empiricus, Against the Mathematicians, Book 7, verse 157. The academics' arguments for the skeptical theses, then, include crucial assumptions taken over from their Stoic opponents. Arcesilaus and the academics who came after him argued that the Stoic conditions for knowledge were impossible to meet. For every true impression formed in the ideal conditions specified by the Stoics, they argued, there could be another impression that was indistinguishable from it, but false. In support of this contention, they raised many doubts of a kind familiar to us from the later skeptical tradition, based on dreams, madness, other abnormal states of mind, optical illusions, and the like. Though they did not deny that many of our impressions are likely true, they argued that none is self-evidently true, and none, therefore, is fit to serve as a criterion of truth, as the Stoics understood it. The Stoics, in contrast, argued that action, and therefore life, was impossible without assent, which they insisted was warranted only by apprehensive impressions. The implication was that the academic argument must be mistaken. Arcesilaus responded by trying to show that action without assent was possible, so forestalling this line of criticism. On a strictly dialectical interpretation, according to which the academics' premises are borrowed from their opponent's position and assumed for the sake of argument in order to deduce consequences that are problems for those opponents, the academics themselves were not committed to the conclusions of their arguments. It was the wise person, as conceived by Stoic philosophy, and not the wise person as conceived by the academics, who would be required to suspend judgment if those arguments were sound. Nonetheless, most of the philosophers of the Academy after Arcesilaus' time, with variations and exceptions, seem to have adopted a stance or an outlook summed up in the two key teachings of acatalepsia and of epoche, both of which they plausibly imputed to him. The fullest account we have, Cicero's Academica, suggests that these terms were used by at least some academics to characterize the attitude of open-minded inquirers who have so far been unable to resolve the difficulties uncovered by their investigations, and who therefore provisionally suspend judgment. In other words, the best ancient testimony indicates that Arcesilaus and his followers did not fall into the kind of contradictory position the ancient skeptics were sometimes accused of holding by claiming to know that nothing can be known, and which modern scholars call negative dogmatism or dogmatic skepticism with regard to knowledge. Diogenes' account of Pyrrho in Book 9 combines a biography of the founder with an extensive exposition of the philosophy of his school in its late form, Book 9, verses 74 to 108, an approach similar to that in Book 7, covering the life of Zeno of Citium and Stoic philosophy. I will concentrate on the sections Diogenes devotes to Pyrrho's life, philosophy, Book 9, verses 61 to 69, students, Book 9, verse 70, and alleged precursors, Book 9, verses 71 to 73. According to Diogenes, Pyrrho was a painter before turning to philosophy under the influence of Anaxarchus, who introduced him to Democritean teachings, Both men seem to have been most influenced by Democritus as an ethical thinker rather than a natural philosopher, although Pyrrho may also have been influenced by Democritus' occasional expressions of doubt about the possibility of reliable knowledge. He and Anaxarchus are said to have accompanied Alexander the Great. This enabled Pyrrho to mingle with the naked sages, or gymnosophists, of India and the Magi of Persia. Book 9, verse 61. Diogenes assigns the encounter with Eastern wisdom a crucial part in Pyrrho's approach to philosophy, inspiring his introduction of two novel teachings, that nothing is apprehensible, akatalepsia, and that therefore a suspension, epoche, of judgment about all claims to know the truth is warranted. As we have seen, however, there is reason to think that these two terms were first used in the Academy. The gloss on Pyrrho's views that Diogenes immediately goes on to offer does not help clarify matters. For he said that nothing is beautiful or ugly, or just or unjust, and that likewise in all instances nothing exists in truth, but men do everything by custom and by habit, for each thing is no more this than that. The view expressed here sounds less like a form of skepticism, that we lack knowledge and should suspend judgment, than a dogmatic denial that certain things exist and an explanation for the illusion that they do, custom or habit. What is more, the emphasis is plainly on moral properties. Indeed, Cicero knew Pyrrho only as a moral thinker, whom he classifies together with the heterodox Stoic Ariston of Chios as an indifferentist, someone who holds that nothing apart from virtue is of the slightest value, including those items to which most ordinary human beings and many philosophers attach importance: health, wealth, good reputation, status, pleasure, and so on. Diogenes relates the story of how Pyrrho was allegedly prevented from straying in front of carts or walking over cliffs and the like only by friends concerned for his safety. Book 9, verse 62. The anecdote invites an epistemological interpretation. Because he distrusted the evidence of his own senses, Pyrrho was a menace to himself, rescued only by the good sense of his friends. But most of what Diogenes says about Pyrrho's character and the anecdotes offered about his life invite an ethical reading. Calmness, tranquility, peace of mind, imperturbability, and detachment from worldly affairs, these are the traits Diogenes stresses in his portrait. Pyrrho's student, Nausiphanes, reports that his own student, Epicurus, often quizzed him about the man whose life and attitude he admired greatly. Book 9, verse 64. Ataraxia, or freedom from distress, one of the qualities for which Pyrrho was most celebrated, is one of the chief characteristics of the fully happy human being, according to Epicurus, as it had been for Democritus. The flavour of Pyrrho's reputation is conveyed by a story related by the Stoic Posidonius, circa 135 to circa 51 BC. On board a ship in a stormy sea, Pyrrho directed the attention of his panicky fellow passengers to a pig, which continued eating in complete indifference to the danger. That, he said, was the kind of tranquillity, ataraxia, the philosopher should cultivate. Book 9, verse 68. Thus, though the sources cited in Book 9 see Pyrrho as a skeptic in the mould of later Pyrrhonists, much of what Diogenes relates about him supports Cicero's picture of a moral indifferentist who embodied to an especially high degree the ancient ideal of wisdom as a kind of supreme imperturbability and detachment. Later, skeptics, in fact, raised various doubts about the existence of a continuous succession connecting Pyrrho with later Pyrrhonism. Book 9, verses 115 to 116. Some even questioned whether the school's members should be named after him. The Pyrrhonian answer to such doubts, recorded by Diogenes, is instructive. Someone who resembles Pyrrho in thought and life could be called a Pyrrhonian. Book 9, verse 70. Sextus Empiricus takes a similar line. The school is called Pyrrhonian because Pyrrho seems to us to have approached skepticism more bodily and visibly than anyone before. Outlines of Pyrrhonism, Book 1, verse 7. This tends to confirm that it was Pyrrho's manner of life and attitude that impressed later followers at least as much as his teachings. Diogenes has hardly anything to say about those teachings. For help, we must turn to Eusebius, quoting Aristocles' summary of Timon's account of Pyrrho's views. Pyrrho's pupil, Timon, says that whoever wants to be happy must consider these three questions. First, how are things by nature? Secondly, what attitude should we adopt toward them? Thirdly, what will be the outcome for those who have this attitude? According to Timon, Pyrrho declared that 1. Things are equally indifferent, unmeasurable, and inarbitrable. 2. For this reason, neither our sensations nor our opinions tell us truths or falsehoods. 3. Therefore, for this reason, we should not put our trust in them one bit, but we should be unopinionated, uncommitted, and unwavering, saying concerning each individual thing that it is no more than it is not, or it both is and is not, or it neither is nor is not. The context, in both Eusebius and in Aristocles, suggests that Timon's point is epistemological, and the passage may describe a possible dogmatic form of skepticism about the impossibility of knowledge. Probably the most widely accepted reading of this passage is epistemological. It endorses a plausible emendation that would have Pyrrho deduce 1 from 2 by reading through the fact that, instead of for this reason, in 2. On this reading, 2 is about the weakness of our mind or our senses, presumably established by familiar skeptical arguments based on conflicts among appearances and judgments, and the conclusion in 1 is about the impossibility of knowledge. According to an alternative metaphysical interpretation, which retains the manuscript reading for this reason, Pyrrho's point of departure is an insight into the indeterminate nature of reality, from which he concludes that our minds and senses cannot be trusted, not because they are defective, but because reality lacks the determinate nature it would need in order to be grasped. According to a third ethical interpretation, which also retains the manuscript readings, 1 describes things insofar as they relate to action and conduct. The epistemological emphasis in 2 would, according to these interpretations, be due to Timon rather than Pyrrho. The matter remains controversial, and Pyrrho's real thoughts are likely to remain elusive. What little is known about him is compatible with different readings, and the same seems to have been true of his pronouncements, such as they were. Pyrrho's truest legacy to the school that bore his name may well have been the image of a life of supreme tranquillity, detached from any positive assertions about the good conduct of life. The most distinctive characteristic of later Pyrrhonism, which set it apart from academic skepticism, was its goal, a suspension of judgment, as Diogenes memorably writes, attended by tranquillity as if by its shadow. Book 9, verse 107. Sextus, who goes into the matter more fully, represents this as a chance discovery. Seeking to resolve the anomalies presented by conflicting appearances and opinions, Pyrrho's followers were compelled to suspend judgment by the opposing considerations of equal strength on each side of every question. The peace of mind they had long sought, though in vain, came as the unexpected result. Outlines of Pyrrhonism, Book 1, verses 25 to 30. Later Pyrrhonism, then, uniquely combines the tranquility exemplified by Pyrrho with practices of argument leading to suspension of judgment, for which the Sceptical Academy was the most important, though not the only, source. Epicurus in Diogenes Laertius, James Allen. Epicurus is the subject of the 10th and last book of Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, compare Book 1, verse 15, and the last of the Italian line of philosophers according to the fanciful successions Diogenes used as an organizing principle. Other members of that line were discussed in Book 9, including Democritus, the ancient Greek world's most prominent atomist, before Epicurus, and a critically important influence on him in physics and ethics, despite his protestations of independence. While the plan of the Lives therefore dictated where the treatment of Epicurus would fall, his appearance at the end of the work had a further significance. In one of the handful of passages that seem to afford a glimpse of the author, Diogenes tells us that the chief maxims, 40 statements by Epicurus, that will conclude Book 10 will also be the crown, colophon, or summit of his book as a whole. By closing his work in this way, he says he will have made its end the starting point of the happy life. Book 10, verse 138. This expression of sympathy for Epicurus, together with other signs of approval, has led some scholars to suspect that Diogenes was himself an Epicurean. Book 10 is unique in presenting the views of its subject at length in his own words. Apart from the biographical and doxographical material of the kind familiar to us from the other 9 books and the 40 doctrines, it contains 3 letters from Epicurus to his followers, summarizing and expounding his teachings for their benefit. These letters are a primary source for what we know about the teachings of Epicurus, but they are also notoriously hard to understand. The result is a book with the following plan, the bulk of which is made up of primary source material. 1 to 29, Epicurus' life. 30 to 33, canonic epistemology. 34 to 83, the letter to Herodotus, which tackles natural philosophy, broadly conceived. 83 to 116, the letter to Pythocles, which concentrates on one department of natural philosophy, heavenly phenomena, meteorology in the ancient sense, such as the size of the sun, the waxing and waning of the moon, and the like. 117 to 21, an ethical doxography, chiefly the attributes of the wise person. 121 to 35, the letter to Menicius, about ethics. 136 to 38, more ethical doxography, especially about pleasure. 139 to 54, chief maxims. We have nothing like these letters for the other 2 main Hellenistic schools, the Stoa and the Academy. Thanks to the letters and the poem De Rerum Natura, the 1st century BC masterpiece in Latin verse by Lucretius, a follower of Epicurus, we are better supplied with first-hand information about his philosophy than that of any of his rivals. Diogenes begins with a biography of Epicurus, 341 to 270 BC. Though an Athenian citizen, Epicurus was born on the Ionian island of Samos, coming to Athens only at age 18. In his early years, in a pattern familiar from other lives related by Diogenes, He studied with a number of teachers, including the Platonist Pamphilus, Book 10, verses 13 to 14. One of his mentors was the Democritian philosopher Nausiphanes. To judge by the harsh words allegedly exchanged between the two, their relations were strained. Book 10, verses 8 and 13. Compare Book 9, verse 69. Epicurus' polemics On Nature and ancient charges that he plagiarized Nausiphanes in his work on epistemology suggest that his teacher was more important to Epicurus than his claim to have learned nothing from him would indicate. According to other testimonies preserved by Diogenes, Epicurus was stimulated to pursue philosophy by reading Democritus on his own and was self-taught, Book 10, verses 2 to 3 and 13. His insistence on his own originality and independence, however accurate, set him apart from other philosophers of his time. The life includes an extensive catalogue of abuse and slander directed at Epicurus, Book 10, verses 3 to 8. According to some reports, he returned the favour with interest, Book 10, verse 8. But Diogenes clearly believed that this charge was itself a slander, as a champion of the view that pleasure is the primary and natural good, and that happiness, the supreme goal, consists of a life of pleasure. Epicurus was peculiarly vulnerable to accusations that he led a dissipated life. According to Diogenes, Timocrates, a one-time follower of Epicurus and brother of his lifelong friend and philosophical partner, Metrodorus, made a minor career out of such charges after leaving the school. Book 10, verse 6. Attacks like this were to be expected. What surprises is Diogenes' impassioned defense of Epicurus. Surely his detractors must have been mad. Book 10, verse 8, for he was a man of universal goodwill, philanthropia, and a generous friend esteemed by all who knew him. Diogenes cites testimony that Epicurus and his companions, far from living a life of sybaritic indulgence, were remarkably austere in their tastes and habits. Book 10, verses 9 to 11. The account squares with what we know from other sources, even critics of Epicurus, like Cicero, who conceded that Epicurus was indeed, as his followers maintained, a decent, kind, and abstemious man, while insisting his admirable life conflicted with his philosophy. The school founded by Epicurus on a property he purchased outside Athens' walls came to be known as the Garden, a true community of friends, says Diogenes, drawn from all walks of life, including Epicurus' servants who practiced philosophy together with him. Book 10, verse 10. With a few exceptions, the people he attracted remained friends for life. Diogenes is struck by the school's long, continuous history, which he views as a tribute to the bonds fashioned by Epicurus in the early days of the community, Book 10, verse 9, one that he says survived after others perished, though scholars suspect Diogenes is echoing a source from an earlier period, rather than referring to an Epicurean school still extant in his own day. Epicurus' will and a letter written shortly before his death, with which the biographical portion of his life concludes, lend support to the admiring portrait already sketched, Book 10, verses 16 to 22. The will freed his slaves and provided for the maintenance of friends and for the children of Metrodorus, who had died before him. It also secured the continuation of the school by naming Hermachus as his successor. Other provisions may suggest something like a cult to modern readers. The injunction that his birthday be celebrated each year, for example, and that his memory and that of Metrodorus be honoured on one day of each month. Following his usual practice, Diogenes appends an account of one of Epicurus' most prominent students, Metrodorus, who is the subject of a brief life, and others who are merely named. He adds a list of his best books, rather than all of them, because, according to Diogenes, Epicurus was an exceptionally prolific author, much given to repetition and disinclined to revise. Book 10, verses 26 to 28. Diogenes now turns to Epicurus' philosophy, as expounded in the 3 letters, prefacing the letter to Herodotus with a brief but illuminating account of Epicurean epistemology, or canonic. The word canon means straight edge, and though Epicurus was not the first to use the term in the metaphorical sense of a standard of judgment or measure of truth, he seems to have been most responsible for turning it into a term of art in Hellenistic epistemology. Another important innovation is his formulation of the idea of a concept, prolepsis, to which he assigns a crucial role in thinking and reasoning. The term and the idea were taken over by the Stoics, and the notion of concepts has exerted an immense influence on the whole subsequent history of philosophy. Above all, he set the agenda for Hellenistic epistemology, and thereby much of the philosophy it influenced, with his insistence that human knowledge and understanding are rooted in perceptual experience. Book 10, verses 31 to 32. Compare Book 10, verse 38. Epicurus intended the letters to serve as summary presentations of his teachings for those who lacked the time or the ability to master their more detailed treatment in his treatises. Book 10, verses 35 to 37. Despite this, they are as formidably difficult as any works of ancient philosophy, especially the letter to Herodotus. The philologist Hermann Usner, whose 1887 edition of the letters marked a major advance in Epicurean scholarship, said in the preface to the Epicuria, his magnum opus, that he had devoted the better part of his energies to it for years, not out of a liking for the man or an interest in his philosophy, but because of the exceptional challenge presented by the many difficulties in the letters preserved by Diogenes Laertius. The letter to Herodotus concerning physics is the longest of the 3, but it would be a mistake to infer that Epicurus regarded the subject as the most important part of philosophy. Rather, he believed, as did other Hellenistic philosophers, that its study contributed to happiness, the achievement of which is the concern of ethics. Happiness is a life of pleasure, according to Epicurus, which is therefore the goal toward which all our choices and actions should be directed. He regarded the removal of all pain as the highest form of pleasure. Once that was achieved, the pleasures of the table or the bedroom were often enough not worth the bother. As other philosophers observed, including antiquity's other school of hedonists, the Cyrenaics, this did not seem at all like pleasure, as it was ordinarily understood. Instead, the condition esteemed by Epicurus resembles the tranquillity, peace of mind, and imperturbability valued by other philosophers, whom no one regarded as hedonists. Indeed, the term ataraxia, already used by Democritus and meaning freedom from mental distress, figures prominently in Epicurus' account of the condition of the happy human being, Book 10, verses 85 and 128, and his interest in Pyrrho's manner of life is also noteworthy. Pyrrho was known and admired above all for his imperturbable calm. Epicurus held that mental pleasure was greater than physical pleasure, and mental pain greater than physical pain. Book 10, verse 137. By making tranquillity impossible, then, fears and anxieties were greater threats to happiness than physical pain. Chief among them, in his view, were anxiety about divine meddling in human life and fear about the fate that awaits us after death, to which superstitious beliefs about both give rise. By providing us with a clear understanding of the nature of reality, the universe, and everything in it, the study of nature demolishes these beliefs and thereby frees us from one of the principal impediments to happiness. Among other things, knowledge of nature will permit us to see that the world we inhabit and perceive is but one of an infinite number of worlds in the infinite universe, formed, as is everything, by the chance collision of atoms. The gods had no part in the creation of this or any other world, and no power to interfere or interest in interfering with us. When we die, our souls, which are compounds of atoms in our bodies, dissolve, so bringing to a total and irreversible end the existence of the self, for which, therefore, there can be no afterlife to be anxious about. Hence the need for natural philosophy. If we were not troubled by false beliefs and the fears and anxieties attendant upon them, natural philosophy would be of no use. Chief Maxims 11 and 12, at Book 10, verses 142 to 143. Compare Book 10, verse 85. The latter proceeds systematically. First, Epicurus declares that nothing comes to be from nothing, or perishes into nothing. Book 10, verse 38. Then he argues that apart from body there also exists void, empty space, a position rejected by Aristotle, and within the world system, as opposed to the universe as a whole, also by the Stoics, Book 10, verse 39. This proposition, like the first, is established by means of an appeal to experience, according to Epicurus. Motion, whose existence is a fact proved by observation, would be impossible without void space into which bodies can move. There follow arguments that there is a lower limit to the physical division of bodies. At this point, one reaches indivisible, absolutely indestructible, perfectly solid atoms. Book 10, verse 41. That space is infinite in extent, and atoms are infinite in number, and of an indefinitely large, though not infinite, number of shapes. Book 10, verses 41 to 42. We also learn a good deal about how perception works. Bodies emit continuous effluences, films of atoms, which cause perception when they come into contact with organs of sense. The perceptions to which they give rise are, of course, the basis for the reasoning that yields the atomic explanation for the process of perception itself. Though these topics are expected in an exposition of natural philosophy, two other distinctive views in the letter to Herodotus are not. The first is Epicurus' so-called doctrine of minimal parts, Book 10, verses 56 to 59. Not only did he hold that the division of bodies into physically distinct parts, separated from one another by void space, must come to an end, he also maintained that the intellectual or theoretical division of space, whether void or occupied by body, into smaller units of spatial magnitude, has an absolute lower limit. So whenever there are two atoms of unequal size, the volume, length, or whatever you like, of each must be a whole number multiple of the least unit, not further divisible, of the corresponding kind. It is impossible for one to exceed the other in size by a fraction of this unit. Epicurus seems to have held the same for time, denying that every finite length of time is divisible into shorter units. His position is in striking contrast to that of Aristotle, and it was likely devised in conscious opposition to it. Aristotle believed in a single finite world, every physical part or portion of which was potentially divisible without limit, as was every finite interval of time in the infinite span of its existence. Epicurus held that the universe is eternal, infinitely extended in space and containing an infinite number of worlds, yet he maintained that finite portions of space were divisible into smaller units of spatial magnitude only a finite number of times. In common with some other ancient philosophers, Epicurus regarded the developments of human culture as a chapter of natural philosophy. This explains why the letter to Herodotus includes discussion of the origins of speech and language, the second surprising topic it tackles. Epicurus opposes other philosophical and popular accounts which consider speech, as well as other distinctive human achievements, a gift of the gods, an invention of exceptionally gifted human beings, or in other ways a manifestation of divine providential regard for humankind. In Epicurus' own explanation, the communicative potential of human beings' natural powers to emit and hear sounds is spontaneously discovered and only later refined and enlarged gradually by deliberate conscious effort. The effect is to diminish the gap between animals and human beings. And by emphasizing that linguistic communication is the result of discovering uses for the powers of voice and hearing, rather than, as other philosophers held, the purpose for which they were designed or the use for whose sake they exist, his theory can fairly be viewed as the ancestor of efforts to explain the development of speech and language in the context of evolutionary theory. The prominence Diogenes gives to meteorological phenomena by including the letter to Pythocles is explained by Epicurus' view that heavenly phenomena are an especially fertile breeding ground for superstition. Compare Chief Maxims 13 at Book 10, verse 143. Even Aristotle had thought there was an important element of truth in the perennially popular view that the heavenly bodies were divine and that celestial phenomena showed the gods at work. Metaphysics 1074, A 38 to B 10. The most distinctive and original element of Epicurus' approach to celestial matters is the method of multiple explanation, which gives the letter an interest beyond the phenomena discussed in it. He held that our aim as natural philosophers should not always be to discover the single correct explanation for the phenomena under examination, as it was in establishing the fundamental principles of the natural world. Rather, Epicurus says, one should be satisfied if we can find a number of possible explanations and not insist on rejecting some in favor of others when there are no grounds to do so. Book 10, verses 87, 94, 98, and 113. For example, the waning and, in turn, the waxing of the moon may be due to the rotation of the body and equally well to configurations assumed by the air. They may also be due to occultations, or may happen in any of the ways the facts of our experience can suggest to explain such phenomena. But one must not be so enamored of the explanation based on a single cause as groundlessly to reject the others from ignorance of what can and cannot be understood by a human being, and the consequent longing to understand what cannot be understood. Furthermore, it may be that the moon's light emanates from itself. Alternatively, it may be derived from the sun. Book 10, verse 94. Since the ultimate aim is to banish superstition, it suffices to know there are plausible natural explanations for a phenomenon without being certain which explanation is correct. But evidence from outside the letter suggests Epicurus also held the intriguing view that in an infinite universe containing infinite worlds and existing for eternity, all genuinely possible explanations must be realized in some world at some time, if not in our own world at this time. Compare Lucretius Book 5, verses 526 to 533. The letter to Menicius contains explanations of and arguments for some of the central ethical teachings of Epicurus. One of its main effects is to demonstrate how much the Epicureans had in common with the arguments of other philosophical schools. It begins with an exhortation to the lifelong study of philosophy, presented as the sure means to happiness, Book 10, verse 122. Epicurus proclaims his belief in the gods, saying he rejects only popular misconceptions of the divine, whose credulous acceptance is true impiety. Book 10, verse 123. Compare Book 10, verse 133. He celebrates possession of the virtues as the sole necessary and sufficient condition for happiness, Book 10, verse 132. Compare Chief Maxims 5 at Book 10, verse 140. He makes short work of the charge that when his school identifies pleasure as the goal, it means the pleasure of a dissolute life, Book 10, verses 131 to 132. Above all, he embraces the ancient philosophical ideal of self-sufficiency, which frees us from dependence on circumstances beyond our control and renders our happiness immune to the influence of fortune, Book 10, verses 130 and 134. Compare Chief Maxims 16 at Book 10, verse 144. In what is perhaps the most innovative element in the system expounded in the letter, however, desires are divided into three kinds: 1, natural and necessary; 2, natural but not necessary; and 3, neither natural nor necessary. Book 10, verse 127. Compare Chief Maxims 26, 29, and 30 at Book 10, verses 148 to 149. Natural and necessary desires must be satisfied for one to live, to be free of pain, and to be happy. They are few and easily satisfied. Non-natural desires, those based on false opinions about what is good or necessary to our happiness, are empty. An ancient gloss, or scholion, to Chief Maxims 29 offers desires for crowns or for statues dedicated in one's honour, as examples. Book 10, verse 149. Had Epicurus been content with these two divisions, his view would seem to belong to the ascetic tendency so prominent in ancient philosophy. The key to happiness, from that perspective, is to reduce one's desires to the bare minimum, the better to diminish or eliminate the chances of failing to fulfill them. The cynic Diogenes of Sinope, for example, Book 6, could plausibly be viewed as following such a strategy. But Epicurus recognized another class of desires, natural to have and harmless to fulfill, even though we can be happy without satisfying them. The same scholion gives the desire for luxurious food as an instance, Book 10, verse 149. Epicurus' idea, which sets him apart from the philosophical apostles of the ascetic life, with whom he otherwise had so much in common, seems to have been that there need be no harm in desiring and enjoying a full range of pleasures so long as we are able to take them or leave them. Any other attitude, as Epicurus observes in Chief Maxims, will be a recipe for misery. Book 10, verse 149. Correct appreciation of the nature of desires will permit us to enjoy all the pleasures life has to offer when circumstances permit, but allow us to remain just as contented when they do not. He concludes the letter by affirming that those who take these and similar truths to heart will live like gods among men. Book 10, verse 135. After a brief section on ethical subjects omitted in the letter, Diogenes sets out the 40 chief maxims that he describes as the crown of his lives, Book 10, verses 138 to 154. All but 2 relate to ethics, 24 and 25 concern epistemology. When natural philosophy is mentioned, its value or use, not its substantive content, is discussed. No overall plan seems to govern the collection, though there are clusters of doctrines dedicated to common themes. 2 clusters deserve special attention. Doctrines 31 to 39. Book 10, verses 150 to 154, present in concise form Epicurus' theory of justice, which shows his ability to cast a fresh eye on an important subject. He rejects theories of natural justice, according to which our behavior toward one another is subject to a set of obligations applying to all human beings in all circumstances, independently of positive law. 33. On the contrary, he maintains that justice has no existence outside a compact or convention. It imposes no obligations on and affords no protections to those not party to the compact. Nevertheless, he speaks of natural justice as well as the nature of justice and a corresponding concept of justice. 31, 37. The nature of justice is to be a mutually beneficial agreement not to harm on condition of not being harmed. There is a standard against which systems of justice can be measured, and a perspective from which they can be criticized. Doctrine 38 explains how different compacts containing different rules can be equally just because of variations in local conditions, and how a compact that had been just because it promoted mutual benefit could, owing to changing circumstances, cease to be just in whole or in part. The second noteworthy cluster comprises the first 4 doctrines, which contain a compact summary of the promise of Epicurean philosophy, and are likely what Diogenes had principally in mind when he spoke of ending his book with teachings that are the beginning of happiness. Book 10, verses 139 to 140. Later, Epicureans condensed the 4 doctrines even further into the so-called tetrapharmakos, or fourfold remedy. God presents no fears, death no worries, and while the good is readily attainable, evil is readily endurable. Diogenes Laertius and Nietzsche, Glenn W. Most. It is well known that Friedrich Nietzsche began his career as a classicist, but turned himself into an important figure of modern philosophy. Less well known is the role that Diogenes Laertius played in this trajectory. As a philosopher, Nietzsche admired Diogenes Laertius for transmitting memorable anecdotes and reports regarding the lives and doctrines of the great Greek philosophers, and Nietzsche learned from him a lesson about the relation of philosophy and life that would shape his own thought and legacy. But as a young philologist who studied Diogenes with the more limited project of investigating his methods and reliability as a compiler of earlier sources on the history of Greek philosophy, Nietzsche ended up having a much less positive view of his value. To explain this curious state of affairs, we must begin with a few words about Diogenes himself. Like most prose authors of later antiquity, Diogenes Laertius composed his treatise by compiling, selecting, arranging, and revising the works of his predecessors. After all, by Diogenes' time, many centuries had elapsed since the death of most of the philosophers he was discussing. Their original writings were frequently difficult to understand, and many were hard or even impossible to come by. Those writings that did circulate were often incomplete, textually corrupt, or even forged. An enormous scholarly literature on this vast and heterogeneous material had already developed. Under these circumstances, it would have been irresponsible, even irrational, for Diogenes to refuse to take advantage of the scholarship of preceding generations. In this regard, his situation is not essentially different from our own. But we are the uneasy heirs of centuries of the gradual professionalization, improvements, and refinement in historical method. Whatever doubts and controversies still mark contemporary research, nowadays no reputable historian of philosophy or of any other subject will fail to attempt to obtain access to original sources, to evaluate them with regard to their authenticity and reliability as scrupulously as possible, or to attain as full, as systematic, and as critical an overview of the secondary scholarship as possible. Historiography in the ancient world was less disciplined and consistent, more amateurish and individualistic. It would obviously be unfair to measure Diogenes' work by the standards of our own day, but even within the terms of ancient scholarship, his treatise displays a number of perplexing features. On the level of surface detail, it seems rife with incoherencies, contradictions, obscurities, and non sequiturs. The style is uneven, and where quotations begin and end is often unclear. More generally, the work raises at least 3 questions regarding its own character: the dates of the author, his philosophical orientation, and his intended audience. An answer in one passage seems to contradict another, or what we think we know about an ancient Greek philosophy from other sources. How are such difficulties to be dealt with? Since the Renaissance, various strategies have been tried. Ignore them, amend them to produce a more acceptable meaning, on the theory that they arose not in the head of the original author, but in the hands of subsequent scribes, or try to explain them away. None of these maneuvers has been very successful. Ignoring the problems has not made them disappear. Much of the language has proved resistant to emendation, and the intellectual contortions required to explain away the difficulties are seldom worth the exegetical gains. What is more, piecemeal approaches are always hampered by their trade in hypotheses invented ad hoc. Would a different kind of approach not be preferable, one that solved all the puzzles at once? Precisely this was the young Nietzsche's idea. Suppose the internal inconsistencies, or those reports that conflict with what we think we know about Diogenes or Greek philosophy, were written originally not by Diogenes, but by his sources, and that he had simply copied them into his own work. If we could determine which sources he had used, could we not interpret the problematic passages more satisfactorily, and would we not be in a better position to assess the reliability of the information he transmits? By asking these questions, Nietzsche applied to Diogenes Laertius the recently developed and fashionable German scholarly method of Quellenforschung, or source criticism, and by providing startling, if specious, answers, he launched a brilliant, if brief, academic career. Nietzsche was one of the first to try to develop a single, coherent, and universal theory of the relations between Diogenes and his sources. His strategy was to explain discrepancies within the lives as the result of differences among the sources. Its goal was to arrive at a hypothetical but highly detailed narrative of the ways in which Diogenes had excerpted, compressed, and compiled all the sources available to him, one that would show the text as we have it as the inevitable result of all these operations. In the writings Nietzsche published for a non-professional audience, the few explicit references to Diogenes are uniformly positive. He is held up as a model for a true understanding of at least the spirit, if not the letter, of Greek philosophy, in opposition to the German academic establishment of professional philosophers and classicists, who looked down on him, but in fact understood far less about the real character of the Greek philosophers than he did. So, most famously, in Schopenhauer as Educator, the third of Nietzsche's untimely meditations, published in 1874, who, for example, will save the history of Greek philosophy once again from the soporific fumes that have been diffused upon it by the learned, but not overwhelmingly scientific, and unfortunately extremely boring, works of Ritter, Brandis, and Zeller? I, for one, would rather read Laertius' Diogenes than Zeller, because in the former there lives at least the spirit of the ancient philosophers, but in the latter neither that spirit nor any other one. And in a number of crucial passages, Nietzsche wrote about the lives and characters of the Greek philosophers, especially the pre-Socratics, for example, in Philosophy in the Age of Tragedy, and the section on the tyrants of the spirit in Human, All Too Human. Diogenes' influence is transparent, even if Nietzsche does not mention him by name. Intense study of the texts of Diogenes was also crucial in helping Nietzsche to free himself from the constraints of university philology and philosophy, and to develop a new and deeply personal conception of the relation between philosophical speculation and a philosophical way of life, one that was to make a strong impression on subsequent generations. By contrast, the view of Diogenes to be found in the writings of Nietzsche, composed as a classical philologist and intended for a professional readership, starts unenthusiastically and concludes extremely negatively. The more Nietzsche worked on Diogenes in his early years, the more he came to see him, not as a learned and honest authority on ancient Greek philosophy, but instead as a liar, a thief, and a fool. For example, in an unpublished manuscript on Laertius Diogenes and his sources, a contribution to the history of ancient literary studies, he writes, "What is Laertius Diogenes to us? Nobody would waste a word about the low-brow physiognomy of this writer if he were not by chance the dim-witted watchman who guards treasures without having a clue about their value. He is the night watchman of the history of Greek philosophy. No one can enter into it unless he has given him the key." In the years 1866 to 1868, Nietzsche worked on the competition prize question De Laerte Diogenes Fontibus, on the sources of Diogenes Laertius, researching not only the sources of Diogenes himself, but also those of imperial, late ancient, and Byzantine scholarship and of various earlier classical and Hellenistic Greek prose authors, Herodotus, Aristotle, as well as the ancient life of Hesiod. The Byzantine encyclopedia, Suda, which presents significant overlaps with Diogenes' texts, was a particular focus, along with such other authorities as Apollodorus, Athenaeus, Plutarch, Aulus Gellius, Hesychius, Eustathius, the Etymologicum Magnum, and Stobaeus. Nietzsche's posthumously printed notes show how many radically different hypotheses he tried out, and how gradually and tentatively he developed his provisional conclusions. Yet the three lengthy philological studies he published on the subject in 1869 and 1870 are clear, dogmatic, and self-assured. In all three essays, he argued that almost all the information to be found in Diogenes Laertius was derived not from the earliest sources Diogenes names, but from a single intermediate source, the lost Compendium of the Philosophers, written by the shadowy figure Diocles of Magnesia, whom Nietzsche assigns to the 1st century BC, although most more recent scholars date him a century earlier. In Nietzsche's view, Diocles himself had cited many of the earlier sources he had used, such as the lost work on homonyms by the 1st century BC author Demetrius of Magnesia. Diogenes had done little more than mechanically transcribe Diocles' source references together with his data, remarks on dating, etc., into his own work. According to Nietzsche's hypothesis, Diogenes had also inserted some individual reports he derived from the works of Favorinus, circa AD 85 to 155. Nietzsche at one point even suspected Favorinus had been Diogenes' sole source for most of his information. He also later suggested that for the Pyrrhonian skeptics, Diogenes had used another, unidentifiable source. The significant overlaps between the reports in Diogenes and in the Suda were due not to the latter having derived its information from the former, but to the dependence of both texts upon lost common sources. The real reason Diogenes had written his book, Nietzsche suggested, was to provide an artificial framework that would justify republishing the wretched epigrams he had written about the deaths of the philosophers. Nietzsche further speculated that these had been a total failure with the public when they had first appeared as part of a collection of his miscellaneous poems, and that he was anxious to find a pretext for republishing them. Nietzsche's analysis was intended to unmask Diogenes not only as a thief who had stolen all the jewels he passed off to posterity as his own, but also as a writer so stupid he did not notice that many of the sources he was transcribing made statements about chronology and philosophical orientation that became nonsense when Diogenes took them over, unchanged. No doubt, partly in order to emphasize the value and brilliance of his own research, Nietzsche exaggerated both Diogenes' importance and his stupidity. He came to do so by closely analyzing some of the same passages that had bothered earlier scholars, and that have continued to bother later ones, partly by uncritically accepting as fundamental methodological principles 4 suspicions about Diogenes as a writer and as a person. 1. Somnolence. Over and over again, Nietzsche asserted that Diogenes must have been half asleep when he excerpted his sources. Evidently, Diogenes had transcribed so much that he became tired and simply kept on copying out things that were irrelevant or false without even noticing what he was doing. 2. Indolence. Nietzsche preferred to assume fewer sources rather than more sources. He suspected Diogenes to have been so lazy that he stayed with one source as long as possible and only moved on to another one when this became absolutely necessary. 3. Second-hand erudition. The more learning Diogenes flaunted, the more Nietzsche presumed he derived it from intermediate sources rather than from his own reading of the sources named. 4. Deliberately misleading references. According to Nietzsche, Diogenes always took care to mention somewhere the authors he copied, so he could not be accused of having suppressed their names altogether. But to mislead the reader, he took just as much care to mention them only in passing for the sake of minor details, and usually so as to disagree with them. The result was a Diogenes almost incredibly doltish and dishonest to the point of moral turpitude. At one point, adopting the tone of the Vice Squad, Nietzsche wrote, "If we are severe, then we must call this a hypocrisy and unreliability on the part of the author, and we must keep a sharp watch on this kind of character trait." At first, Nietzsche's prodigious exercise in Quellenforschung enjoyed some success. His essay won the prize, perhaps not least because the competition had been designed with him in mind, and apparently no other candidates presented themselves. His research on Diogenes was an important factor in his being offered a professorship at Basel. But within a few years, Nietzsche's theories had started to crumble, and soon they fell apart altogether. In 1880, Ernst Mars, who went on to have a distinguished career as a classical scholar, could still discuss Nietzsche's hypothesis as one that scholars had to take seriously, even if they had to reject it in the end. But already 1 year earlier, Hermann Diels, in his epoch-making work on the Greek doxographers, had contemptuously dismissed the theory as less than a cobweb and had derided Nietzsche for misunderstanding the grammar of the single sentence that served as a linchpin for his whole argumentation. Since then, Nietzsche's work on Diogenes would have been largely forgotten had it not been his work. Philosophically interested readers have usually tended to ignore the more technical writing in classical philology he did as a student and professor. Their tendency may have been reinforced not only by the general disciplinary boundaries separating classics from philosophy since the 19th century, but also in particular by the exclusion of Nietzsche, at least until recently, from the canon of scholars deemed acceptable by the world of professional classicists. More recently, when interest in Nietzsche finally became acceptable in that world, it was above all his speculations on Greek religion and tragedy that commanded their attention. Even within the much smaller world of scholars interested in Diogenes Laertius, Nietzsche has not received much attention, let alone found acceptance. This is not hard to understand, for even though his hypothesis cannot really be disproven, and even though it has found at least one authoritative, albeit half-hearted, defender, it is liable to various objections. For example, the putative centrality of Diogenes encounters grave difficulties if we date him not as Nietzsche did, to the 1st century BC, but instead, as most scholars do now, to a century earlier. Worse is a fatal methodological flaw, for to claim that Diogenes merely took over most of his information thoughtlessly from Diocles means that the text that we actually possess, Diogenes, is denied any intellectual philosophical merit of its own, while its qualities are attributed instead to a different text that we do not possess and about which we know almost nothing. This means not solving the problems posed by Diogenes, but instead just kicking the can down the road. So we can understand why Nietzsche's hypothesis has largely been forgotten, except by specialists. This is regrettable, not because it has a high probability of being correct, but for two other reasons. The first is that Nietzsche's analysis of Diogenes' procedures as a writer shows them to be uncannily, if only partially, similar to certain aspects of his own. Studying Nietzsche on Diogenes helps us understand something about Nietzsche himself. For, as his private notebooks reveal, Nietzsche was not only a brilliant writer, but also a voracious reader, a habit that bore all kinds of fruit in his own work. Many of the texts he wrote, published and unpublished, arose out of his reaction to those he read, and they often so clearly bear the traces of his reading that they can come to look like palimpsests through which we can glimpse, more or less faintly, the lineaments of his library. Nietzsche's use of excerpts from and partial revisions of other writers' texts does not in the least mean he is a plagiarizer, for his intention was not to fool his readers. Rather, he found certain ideas and formulations so fascinating that he could not help but incorporate some version of them into his own thinking and texts. And yet the analogy between Nietzsche and Diogenes is in the end misleading, for the results of Diogenes' reading remain undigested, crudely laid out without having been elaborated and transformed by a searing hermeneutical intelligence. In Nietzsche, everything is rethought and reformulated by an unrelenting process of scriptural metabolism into the style we immediately identify as his own. Perhaps it was Diogenes' lack of assimilation that made Nietzsche so impatient and intolerant of him. The other reason to recall Nietzsche's hypothesis is the more important one for the present volume. What sources Diogenes used and how he used them necessarily remain crucial questions in writing the history of Greek philosophy itself. Nietzsche's source-oriented answers fell out of favor at first because they were problematic, but in the end, because the source-oriented questions for which he devised them fell out of favor themselves. The result has been that for a long time, both Nietzsche's answers and his questions seem to have dropped out of the consciousness of classical philologists. The article on Diogenes Laertius in the standard large-scale encyclopedia of classical philology, dating from the beginning of the 20th century, still takes seriously the business of unravelling Diogenes' sources, though it mentions Nietzsche only once in passing as a dangerous example of manifest error. A German handbook from 1975 declares that it is impossible to know what Diogenes' sources were and how he used them, while the corresponding English reference work asserts, no less dogmatically, that we can trust Diogenes when he tells us what his sources were, and can, in general, know what these were and how he used them. Only more recently has the subject of Diogenes' use of sources returned to the forefront of research in all its fascination and difficulty. Nowadays, we are less inclined to reduce late ancient compilations to the mere sum of their sources, and more to see them as relatively autonomous works with their own dignity, engaged in the creative interpretation and application of the traditions that stand behind them. The result is that the very questions Nietzsche was asking in such a mechanistic and censorious way have lost much of the interest they once had. If reformulated so as to be more flexible and less condemnatory, however, they deserve to be of interest once again. The likeliest explanation for the incoherencies and other defects in Diogenes' treatise is not that he was a plagiarizer. There is no evidence he intended such a deception of his readers any more than Nietzsche did. Instead, we may assume that he did not live to put the finishing touches to his treatise, and that all we possess now are the notes he made from his reading and more or less finished sketches for some chapters. So his book was probably published posthumously. Who were his literary executors, and how competent were they philosophically? Did they compile all of his work, or only a selection of it, and according to what criteria? To what extent, if at all, did they revise it, and why did they publish it? Those tempted to call Diogenes an asinus Germanus, perfect ass, should pray instead that the preparatory notes for their own unpublished works never see the light of day. Had he lived to complete his work, we would doubtless still wonder about the reliability of his sources and his use and interpretation of them. As it is, the unfinished state of his treatise puts those puzzles in relief. We will surely not want simply to adopt Nietzsche's precise answer to them, but nor should we conceal from ourselves how urgent and perplexing they really are. This concludes Lives of the Eminent Philosophers by Diogenes Laertius, translated by Pamela Mensch, edited by James Miller, narrated by Jennifer M. Dixon. Copyright 2018 by Oxford University Press. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Oxford University Press and was produced in the year 2018 by Tantor Media Incorporated, a division of Recorded Books, which holds the copyright thereto. Please visit tantor.com for more information on our growing library of unabridged audiobooks.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.